Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to talk to you today with regards particularly the cancer aspect, which is focused this session on. But I was asked to give a talk the other day, well, a couple of months ago, to the Royal College of Radiologists, the radiotherapy section. They call themselves AD 51. And I said, do you really want me to talk and tell you the truth? Because up to now, everyone said no, 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 and they said, no, tell us the truth. So that basically was the title. And I don't need any need to change it at all for any talk. So the next thing is, I just want to say that I come from a position where I've been shouted down that I'm just a professor of oncology. What do I know about viruses and the immune system? But I just put that up to say that I have been associated with lots of aspects of medical research and the major clinical problems, and have a track record of going against the grain and finding something that really everybody said, no, you can't do that, you can't do this. First of all, it was with cancer immunology, but people said that I should actually point out that it was my original observation that the patients with very, very serious autoimmune diseases who were steroid resistant, would be in intensive care and would die on steroids. And the idea that thalidomide had been shown to have steroid resistant benefit, we ended up using that in a patient on intensive care. And the response was just so incredible with this terrible drug that nobody would develop it, no big pharma would touch it. But I said that if you actually took this drug, the good bits, forget about the bad bits, and they said it causes birth defects, etc. I said, yes, but I'm an oncologist. Everything causes birth defects if you give it to pregnant women at the wrong time, my thing. But the bottom line I put this is that this led to a couple of people in America reading about my report and backing it. And this led to the production of lenalidomide and pomalidomide, which are two of the world's best effective cancer drugs of all time and have revolutionized the treatment of myeloma. So I get very annoyed when people say, oh, you've got no track record of doing this, that, and the other, because we've also been doing the cancer immunotherapy now for 30 years, when nobody would support it. I was told all my grants were turned down because they said that, well, we've had a sort of a world international meeting on this, and we've decided that all the idea the immune system can control cancer is an artifact only confined to mice. Well, now, I mean, it's now the major modality for treatment of several major cancers, including melanoma and lung cancer, and 23 other cancer types now improve with immunotherapy. So I just wanted to point out, with regards to where else I come from and where I believe the problem is, right at the beginning, I said that this is a respiratory virus. You must not lock down. It is up. I mean, I went over the top saying it would be the stupidest thing ever to do to lockdown, particularly when we had no quarantine. I mean, 3 weeks into lockdown, we were having Wuhan flights land at Heathrow every day. So the people who involved with this were basically completely academically incompetent, I would say. So I put this slide up just to show that not only did I shout a lot, but I was actually given a platform on this in the Telegraph and the Daily Mail. And so it was. But right at the beginning, I'd been developing an HIV vaccine with my colleague Børge Sørensen in Norway, and we developed a very effective HIV vaccine on the grounds that the NIH, which is Fauci, and the big pharma basically wanted to use the whole envelope, and they spent 30 years doing minor variation of the same. It was Einstein who said, if you keep doing the same thing, expect a different result. They're clearly stupid. And that's how I basically summed these guys up. Børge and I had the same aspect. Get rid of the envelope, just go for the Achilles heel. And that actually worked very well. I tell you that basically to say that when the sequence of the virus became available, he's immediately on the phone and said, let's make a vaccine the same way for the COVID. just pick the bits which, if they did not exist, the virus would not exist. It is really that simple. So we went through it, and I show you this slide because it was very, very obvious that this virus basically had been engineered. I mean, the only thing, I don't expect you to understand any of the details, because none of my colleagues did. But what I want to point out is that there were all these inserts, which molecularly you can see, they had been inserted into the virus in a laboratory. But the thing that convinced us 100% this came from the lab was, if you look at the bit highlighted in yellow there, it says the charge of the virus was over 8.24. No charge is over 6 of any natural virus. And these inserts were all deliberately designed to make the virus more chargeable. And my interpretation of this was it was a deliberate attempt to make the virus more like a fridge magnet. So it would lock onto the cell because of the charge. The difference between the cell and the virus would make it much more infectious. And I just put the next thing over it. And put the next bit over it to point out that we found the charge was so good that instead of just attaching to the receptor, the ACE2, which everybody knew, which affects that's one of the reasons you get all these cardiac problems, etc., we showed that it was able to interact with other receptors. And just for to point out, we noted actually it could interact with the receptors involved in taste and smell. And that these receptors, when stimulated, cause innate immune suppression. So, I mean, we were able to work a lot on that. We published all this in journals. We couldn't get published for months. We were rejected by everybody, saying this is not in the public interest. We've done a summary of this with Stephen Key in a book called The Origin of the Virus. If you really want to know the details, it is all there. But the point of me telling you all this is that I told everybody that went to the SAGE, it went to the Cabinet, it went through colleagues who knew Michael Gove, everything. So it went to Whitty, all this stuff at Valence, Farrar, and they all decided, no, it wasn't a lab leak, it wasn't engineered, it was natural. I mean, can you believe, we now know, 4 years later, that with the exception of the CIA, everybody agrees now that it came from the lab. The CIA have their own reason, but the FBI actually came out and agreed. So this all just brings me very rapidly to, what else went on? They knew that we were right, but they suppressed it. Now we come to the vaccines. The COVID messenger RNA vaccines and cancer is the bit I really want to bang on about here. Because first of all, with the COVID vaccines, the messenger RNA, that from my point of view, I was never happy about the vaccines because all that data I showed you, that spike protein everybody used to make the vaccine from, 80% of it is human epitopes, i.e. it's identical. We said that the epitopes are so identical that the platelet factor 4, which if you got antibodies to it, involve clotting and platelet problems, and myelin, which goes with Guillain-Barré and all the other neurological things, were 100%. So this was guaranteed if you gave it. Again, we did the warning. Again, they decided to ignore us. And it's even on the MHRA website that these two are very rare. No, they're not. I know lots of people with these problems. But I want to go focus on to the cancer vaccines, the implication of cancers. I, in my clinic, noted after the boosters were introduced, I did not notice this before, after the boosters were introduced, I was seeing melanoma patients. I had been treated successfully immunotherapy 5, 10, up to 18 years, who came into the clinic and they had relapsed, or they were showing evidence of relapse, and we confirmed they relapsed. Now, I've seen this before, but it's usually always in people who've had sudden, severe depression and immune suppression that goes with it. Usually death, bereavement, divorce, bankruptcy, or something like that. None of these patients have had that. So I go, what have you had? What's gone on? And every case, I found that they had been forced to have a booster against their better need. And it was then I pointed this out, and I was told to shut up because I was upsetting the patients. I checked with my other colleagues. I found that colleagues in Australia, South Africa, America, Canada were all seeing exactly the same thing, and they're all being told to shut up. This is when I realized this is really unbelievably Orwellian. They're not interested in the betterment of the health. And I then look back at the vaccines. Others will do that. Clearly, we now know they didn't work at all. There was absolutely no prevention of infection. The whole thing was a total disaster. But from my point of view, I was seeing the cancer, and the other people were seeing it. And I wanted to know why. Well, I developed cancer vaccines and HIV vaccines all my life. And one thing I knew, if a vaccine needs a booster, it doesn't work. This is absolutely true. It's the only time there's an exception when it's not actually really a vaccine, and that's when it's dealing with toxins like tetanus or diphtheria, or it's boosting the innate immune system in the presence of constant suppression like cancer. So here we had clear evidence of a relapse following the boosters, and when you overstimulate things, you cause immune suppression. And I'd learnt all that from HIV. HIV doesn't cause AIDS by killing the CD4 cell, which actually is what I discovered. I discovered CD4 was the receptor, so it all made sense, and then it could kill the cell. No, it doesn't. When you stand back and look at it, you get the suppression because you've overstimulated the immune system, so it's hypercharged, it's firing bullets everywhere and missing, and eventually it gets exhausted. That's exactly what's going on with the booster vaccines. It's overstimulating an immune response against a virus which hasn't been on the planet for 2 years. And that's another thing that we actually wrote and distributed right at the beginning, is viruses against coronaviruses, vaccines against coronaviruses. If they work, they will not work for very long at all, because you get rapid variants, and the immune system, when it gets locked in, cannot see those variants. So the idea that we'll give you a booster with a variant showed how really stupid they were, or they were not interested in the facts, just wanted to go on. So anyhow, the great thing was we'd been looking at the T cells and suppression, and we were saved for us having to do it, saying we are the first to show it, the sort of thing that Fauci would say. A group from the States and others showed that after the booster, you get T-cell suppression. In fact, one of the groups brilliantly called it T-cell exhaustion. So you got rid of the T-cells. Then other groups showed there was IgG class switching. Just let me tell you what this is. In a vaccine, you boost antibodies that will neutralize and kill the virus. When you do the booster, you switch those antibodies to those that say, no, we've done our bit, calm down. They tolerate the response, and this is exactly what you want when you have a transplant. You want tolerization. So all of a sudden, we've got evidence that these vaccines suppress the T-cell response, tolerize the IgG. This is the perfect milieu for cancer to pop up. The melanoma, we saw it in first, but rapidly we saw it in leukemia, lymphoma, and all the other cancers. And how come this, are we really worried about this? And that is, and it's very relevant to this conference, about the idea that we must focus on some form of detoxification of what's going on in people who've had messenger RNA vaccines, to try and reduce all this as much as possible. But we already knew the messenger RNA in particular caused microclotting abnormalities. And then more recently, we found there's a whole range of things that have been discovered, all of which could induce cancer, some of them later on. So this is why I've got so vocal about this. The other thing is that if you keep doing these boosters, you will get this same chronic inflammatory suppression of the immune response. It'll get worse and worse. And I cannot tell you the problems I've had with my own medical profession. I've had people who should know better going to get the booster because they're at risk. I tell the booster's going to make you worse. And when they do get infected, they do get worse. They do have a heart attack, or they do have a cancer pop up. They say, thank God I had the vaccines. Otherwise, I'm not a comedian. I'm just telling you. And I go, it's beyond belief. This is cognitive dissonance, by the way. The psychiatrists would call this cognitive dissonance. I've made my decision. Everything is going to fit in with that was the right decision. I mean, my simple thing is ban all messenger RNA vaccines. Never, ever, ever. And now I've looked into it a lot more carefully. There's a lot more vaccines that need very careful re-evaluation before they should be pulled as well. What we've done is we've looked into all the science that's been used to justify everything from the lockdown, the masks, the distancing, all complete utter crap. There's no scientific basis for any of it whatsoever. We started to look at all the evidence about the vaccines induce a good immune response and what have you, and the justification for the boosters on the ground, the antibodies fall off very quickly. Antibodies fall off very quickly when you get infected, when you have a vaccine. That's what they do, otherwise you have antibodies coming out your ears, which is basically what the simpletons who actually pushed this forward went. And the more I looked at it, the more I realised we had to actually document this, and I just used this little push. And my colleagues and I started writing this about lockdown, but we found there was so much science. They said follow the science. There was no science. People like me shouting. None of us were asked to call in a debate of this, not one of us. We were told, like post office sub-postmasters, that we were the only one. I've subsequently found there was loads of people like me said exactly the same thing to the Cabinet, to Sage, to Whitty, to Vallance, and they totally chose to ignore us. Why? And I basically want to make sure and support you with this, the World Council of Health, that we get in a situation that this can never, ever be inflicted on the British people or the people of the world ever again. I believe we need to hold everyone to account, and I would actually really push for a Nuremberg type investigation on this. We mentioned the WHO. I've always said that we should withdraw from the WHO because they wanted all that power so they could get us to lock down again with one case of bird flu in Mexico. They're terribly keen to do that to push more vaccines, and we have to rise up and stop it. I suspect my time's well over. Thank you.